Grüß, willkommen in einem and in our Fragrance video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 76 of my game system design series of videos. In this video, I'll be investigating what morale represents in figure gaming rules. After completing a study and analysis of Napoleonic morale classifications for different troop types, I was struck at how unclear the concept of morale actually is. Some rules call it quality, experience, grading, level, class, or the most common, morale, which is what I'll be using in this video. While I have to admit this topic was initiated because of my investigation of Napoleonic troop morale types, the lessons do apply to almost all periods, ancients, World War II, Cold War and modern, but I must admit the impact of morale can vary by period, more in ancients, less in World War II, etc. In order to come to grips with this question, that is, what does morale represent in figure gaming rules, I'm going to use the old WRG Wargame Rules 1685 to 1845. While these rules are very much old school sets of rules, it should still give me a valid answer. As in the old days, morale was considered as more important as it is than today in more modern, higher scale rules, it should actually even be clearer. Let's very quickly go through how WRG classifies morale. Now, WRG does class troops as a regular or irregular, but let's ignore it for this exercise, as all these specific morale classes are either regular or irregular. Looking at the morale, the highest is elite. The elite morale includes both guards, grenadiers, which seems reasonable, except I have to admit some guards were not so effective, such as Spanish guards. The next level is veteran. The veteran class are basically men who have experienced a lot of action, which I suspect is troops which have experienced a lot of successful action. Experiencing a lot of disasters may not increase morale. Or alternatively, these troops possess special training. I would expect most cavalry would be classed as veteran in this case, especially hussars and cuirassiers, as they, to the best of my knowledge, do experience special training. Right in the middle we have trained. No surprise here, trained represents most of the troops you would find in a standard army. And right at the bottom of the classification we have raw. The raw classification also, as you can see here, is reasonable, although I feel there is a difference between a well-trained unit which has never seen action, which would be my idea of raw troops or green troops, and, on the other side, badly trained troops, which I would typically call militia or conscripts. However, WRG may have decided to group both of these type of classes together under what they call raw. Now we move into the irregular area, and this kind of mirrors the regular area. Fanatics, the first here, is the equivalent, or the irregular equivalent of elite. And the definition is pretty much self-explanatory. The next level down in the irregular class is soldier, and I would imagine this is the equivalent of veteran. Now, the soldier class is interesting. I would not have considered Jager as irregular, although it does state 7-Year War specifically, and the WRG Napoleonic Army list normally classes Jager as regular, trained, or veteran. So maybe it just simply depends on the period, but nonetheless an interesting troop class. We then move down to warrior, which is the equivalent of trained in the regular world, perhaps. The warrior class makes sense when refighting colonial campaigns in Africa and India, so, I understand why it's included for Napoleonic sets of rules. The only warriors you may come across in Europe would be probably Cossacks, unless, of course, the Ottomans get involved, in which case there would be quite a few warriors there as well. And right at the bottom we have levy class, which is the equivalent of raw. Now, the levy class is something which always throws me, at least in my mind. In my mind, a levy is someone with no training and minimal equipment formed into a horde-like formation, which I admit this class does include in this definition. However, I never considered artillery drivers and crew as levy class, but then, after thinking about it, perhaps civilians should fall in this category. I must admit, in some armies, the artillery were crewed by civilians to some extent, particularly in the early war period, But by 1813-14, this had really dramatically changed, and most artillery crew and drivers would be professional soldiers. Nonetheless, I feel this morale class does seem like a very wide and vague troop type or morale class. After looking at these definitions, I can't help but feel many of them are highly subjective. Let's put the definitions to one side and determine how important morale is in the rules and what the actual game impact is. This may allow us to come to a better conclusion concerning the questions I'm trying to answer, which is, what is morale and what does it represent in figure gaming rules? Let's start our analysis with the point system, as I have to assume the designers would have put a lot of effort into ensuring different troop types were given the correct points value in order to have a balanced game. This chart shows the points impact of morale. If we look at infantry, line infantry, we can see the cost of a musket figure can be halved if raw or levy. Let's mainly focus on just the regular classes for the moment. This means you can field twice the number of raw line infantry compared with trained line infantry. If we move up from raw, we then discover that we pay an extra 50% if the line infantry is elite, with veteran somewhere in between trained and elite. If we move to cavalry, which has a different points values for morale, the cost of elite is about 50% greater than trained, which is similar to infantry, with, again, veteran somewhere in between. The big difference with cavalry is raw. The impact of raw cavalry is not as great as with infantry, only a 20% reduction in this case. My initial conclusion is morale does have a significant impact in a figure gaming set of rules, at least based on points. If 5 battalion of trained line infantry is supposed to be as good as 10 battalions of raw line infantry, we are dealing with a significant quality difference between trained and raw in terms of game system. Let's now work out what those game system differences are. First, we'll look at reaction testing, and this is what I would consider a very important reaction test, which I class generally as fragility, or testing the fragility of a unit. Ignoring other modifiers for now, a raw or levy unit can never rally, while an elite can rally 50% of the time. Other troop types rally 33% of the time. Morale clearly affects the ability of a unit to rally from rout. Morale also has an effect on units which are being charged, with levy and raw having a reasonable chance of routing in this case. In this case, the difference between raw and trained is greater than the difference between trained and elite or veteran. This is another what I class as a fragility reaction test. Testing to rally from pursuit is all about control, and raw and levy are at a significant disadvantage. Veteran are the most controllable morale class. Testing to charge or countercharge enemy not charging the tester is another control-related reaction test. This reaction test is not as clear, but levy troops certainly do not like to charge the enemy, which actually is quite reasonable. Saying that, raw, trained and veteran can all initiate a charge with the same probability of success. Only elite and fanatic have a special advantage when deciding to initiate a charge. Testing to charge home is another control test. This is basically making contact with the enemy. This test only shows elite and fanatic having some benefit. Again, these morale classes like to get into hand-to-hand combat. This is another what I can class as an important test, and it determines how you respond to shooting, which really is a combat effect. While it is also a test of fragility, or the fragility of the unit, this test is an integral part of the shooting combat system, so should be classed or could be classed as a combat-related test. In this case, raw and levy have a disadvantage and elite, veteran and soldier an advantage. Testing after getting the worst of hand-to-hand combat is another important combat reaction test, perhaps the most important in all the rules. Once again, this could be classed as a test of a unit fragility, but is also an integral part of the melee combat system. Melee combat only inflicts casualties. This test gives you the non-casualty related result of any melee combat. In this case, there is a clear advantage for elite and veteran and a clear disadvantage for raw or levy. It's interesting how veteran and elite have similar values for this test. Let's now look at movement, mobility and formation changes. We can see that elite and veteran can perform difficult formation changes in response to a critical situation, which other morale classes cannot. I'm not going to show it here, but there are many other examples where raw troops are at a clear disadvantage compared with, let's say, elite trained or veteran troops when conducting a number of formation changes or move types. Again, this is a function of training and, in this case, is no surprise. Let's now drill into the actual hand-to-hand combat. The hand-to-hand advantage calculation is another important combat-related difference, and it's a critical part of hand-to-hand combat. In this case, elite receives a +1 advantage when charging or being charged. Veteran have an advantage against all other cavalry, that is veteran cavalry. Veteran foot only get an advantage against trained foot. Everyone gets an advantage against raw or levy. When it comes to melee or hand-to-hand combat, morale does have a significant impact, as you would expect. While certainly not a linear relationship, there are clear control, movement and combat effects of morale. One interesting point is the lack of any effect on shooting. Raw troops can shoot as well as veteran or elite. This does imply players would prefer to keep raw troops in a shooting contest and for them to avoid any form of hand-to-hand combat if possible, while veteran or elite would prefer to close with the enemy. And considering that you can have twice as much raw line infantry than trained line infantry, this makes a valid strategy if you have a lot of raw troops. And if you have trained troops, you probably want to get into combat pretty quickly. WRG rules have never been known for their simplicity, but the point systems imply there is some form of linear effect. It's just that when we dive into the rules, the effects can vary across lots of different areas, so it's difficult to mathematically determine the effect of morale by just looking at the actual rules, tables, and specific advantages and disadvantages of different morale types. But we can do this if we focus on the point system. However, when we look at the rules as a general statement, we can say raw troops are more difficult to control in terms of charging the enemy, rallying from pursuit, and formation changes. Raw troops will also break easier and are less likely to rally. Raw troops are in a clear disadvantage when in melee combat. Veteran troops are easier to control, such as when they need to rally from pursuit, but when it comes to charging, they are the same as trained. Veteran troops have superior formation changing capabilities, thus are more mobile and flexible. Finally, veteran troops have an advantage in melee combat. These are stable, mobile troop types, but are not rash and are not any more eager to charge into melee combat than, let's say, trained troops. Elite troops are also easier to control than trained, especially when it comes to charging into contact, but are not easier to control than, let's say, veteran when it comes to rallying from pursuit. Elite troops, in the same manner as veteran, have superior formation changing capabilities, thus are more mobile and flexible. Elite troops have an advantage in melee combat, especially when charging or receiving a charge. Elite troops are a stable, mobile troop types which are keen to get into combat and don't like getting out of a pursuit. Let's try and make sense out of all of this. In the WRG rules, at least, morale has these four broad effects. The first is control. The higher the morale, the more likely the troops will do what they're ordered to do. The next is fragility or unit stability. The lower the morale, the more likely a unit will rout and will not rally. The third is mobility. The higher the morale, the more complex maneuvers are allowed, and these can be conducted quicker. Finally, there is melee combat. The higher the morale, the higher the chance of winning a hand-to-hand combat, or at least inflicting casualties or more casualties than having in the reverse. While there's no difference when a unit shoots, when we look at morale, the response to shooting casualties does show a clear difference, which is also classed under fragility, but is really probably closer to the combat or shooting combat system. However, the quickest way or easiest way of looking morale is the point system. In terms of impact based on the point system, a simple comparison of a line infantry battalion and a dragoon regiment can be made here. In this example, one battalion of trained line infantry should have a similar combat capability to 2 battalions of raw line infantry, and so on. While in the WRG rules the advantages and disadvantages of each morale class does differ and is rather complex to sort out in your mind, the point system, at least in theory, should normalise all that complexity out into a simple comparison, as I've shown here. These morale effects, both within the rules and also the point system, can be related, sort of, to the morale descriptions at the start of the video. By looking at the points impact and actual game effects, we can avoid subjectivity and come down to a more detailed description of what morale should represent in the rules. This is a personal point of view only, but I still find it strange that raw line infantry can conduct shooting as effectively as veteran line infantry. But once we bring in the reaction tests, trained troops or veteran troops will generally outshoot raw troops, so probably from a game balance point of view, it may not be an issue. It just does catch me up in my claw. It just annoys me a bit. I have to admit, this conclusion of this video may seem obvious to anyone. The whole subjective nature of morale, nonetheless, has confused me as I attempt to set morale values against a troop type, which is the reason why I created this video. The one wild card is, do these conclusions still apply to more modern rules? My gut feel is yes, but I have to admit I will need to test this gut feel out one day with some more modern sets of rules. And so we come to an end of episode 76 of my video on game system design, in this case looking at what morale represents in figure gaming rules. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.